Have you ever wondered what life was truly like in the year 1122? Imagine a world where your entire future, your very ability to stand on your own 2 feet, hinged not on your talent or your drive, but solely on who your father was or who you married. What if the ground beneath your feet, the very earth that sustained your family for generations, could never truly be yours, simply because you were born a woman? In the swirling currents of the High Middle Ages, for women, the dream of owning land was often just that, a dream, tangled in a web of ancient laws, societal whispers, and the unyielding grip of power. Number 8, the unending battle for what is yours. Even if, by some twist of fate or through a rare legal loophole, a woman in 1122 managed to acquire some land, her struggle was far from over. Imagine a woman, perhaps a widow, who against all odds inherited a modest piece of property. Her challenges were just beginning. While the legal codes of the time might, in specific and limited circumstances, allow for a woman to hold land, the practical realities of protecting that holding were a monstrous, uphill battle. Unlike her male counterparts, she lacked the inherent authority, the physical might, and often the legal standing to truly defend her claims against those who would seek to strip her of what was hers. Consider the life of Aveline, a fictional but historically plausible woman of the minor gentry in a small English village during the High Middle Ages. Aveline's husband, a relatively prosperous freeholder, passed away unexpectedly. Due to the very specific wording of his will, influenced by a rare moment of progressive thinking or perhaps a powerful attachment to his wife, Aveline was granted direct ownership of a small parcel of land, not just the usual dower interest that reverted to male heirs. This was a monumental victory for Aveline, a glimmer of true independence in a world that seldom offered such things to women. Ink was barely dry on the charter before the vultures began to circle. Her husband's distant cousin, a man named Roger, who had always harbored resentment towards his kinsman's success, immediately laid claim to the land. Roger argued that the terms of the local feudal arrangement, though unwritten in this particular instance, meant the land should naturally revert to the nearest male relative, regardless of the will. He began to subtly undermine Aveline's authority, instructing the tenants on the land to pay their dues to him, questioning her rights at local gatherings, and even sending his own men to graze their sheep on her pasture. Aveline, a woman without the ability to wield a sword or raise a retinue, found herself in an impossible position. She could appeal to the local lord, but the lord, often a man of similar mindset to Roger, might easily side with the male claimant, especially if Roger offered more favorable terms or military service. The legal system, such as it was, relied heavily on oaths, witnesses, and the perceived status of the claimants. A woman's testimony, particularly concerning property, might be easily dismissed or undervalued against a man's. Even if Aveline sought justice in a manorial court, which was rare for women in direct property disputes, she would face an assembly of men, the lord, his bailiff, and the male tenants who served as jurors. Their judgment would be steeped in the patriarchal norms of the era. The very idea of a woman managing land, collecting rents, and administering justice was often considered an anomaly, if not an outright affront to the established order. Aveline would be questioned not just about her legal right to the land, but perhaps also about her character, her ability to manage, or even her suitability as a woman to hold such a position. The threat of violence, while perhaps not overt, always loomed in the background. A woman alone, even with nominal land ownership, was a vulnerable target. She might be pressured to remarry, and once remarried, her land would fall under the control of her new husband, effectively erasing her brief moment of independence. She could be accused of mismanaging the land, of failing to uphold feudal obligations, or of any number of infractions that a male claimant might invent. The burden of proof, in essence, rested disproportionately on her shoulders, and her resources to gather that proof or enforce her rights were severely limited. The absence of a male protector was a catastrophic weakness. A woman who owned land but lacked a powerful husband, father, or brother to act on her behalf was akin to a lamb amongst wolves. The land itself, valuable and desirable, became a magnet for opportunistic male relatives, neighbors, or even the lord himself. He could use intimidation, false claims, or even outright seizure, knowing that a woman's ability to retaliate or secure justice was severely hampered. Medieval chronicles occasionally mention women who did, against incredible odds, successfully defend their property, but these were the exceptions that proved the rule. These women often had extraordinary personal courage, powerful connections or circumstances that were so unusual they garnered specific attention. For the vast majority, the possession of land, even when legally granted, remained a fragile and temporary state, constantly under threat from a system designed by men, for men, and defended by men. Battle for what was truly hers, for a woman like Aveline, was an unending, exhausting, and often unwinnable war. Number 7. The Church's shadowy influence. In the year 1122, the Christian Church was not just a spiritual guide, it was a colossal political, social, and economic powerhouse, its influence permeating every corner of life. Imagine a world where the pronouncements from the pulpit held more sway than any local decree, where bishops were as powerful as barons, and where the teachings of religious texts shaped the very essence of human roles and relationships. For women seeking to own land, the Church, with its deeply ingrained patriarchal doctrines, cast a long and often restrictive shadow, subtly and overtly reinforcing barriers to their economic independence. From a young age, both boys and girls were taught the story of Adam and Eve, a narrative that, as interpreted by medieval theologians, placed women in a subordinate position. Eve was often depicted as the weaker vessel, the instigator of original sin, and therefore her daughters were seen as inherently prone to temptation and less capable of rational thought or leadership. Sermons and religious treatises constantly emphasized women's roles as wives and mothers, primarily within the domestic sphere, responsible for childbearing and household management. The idea of a woman engaging in the public, authoritative role of land ownership and management clashed starkly with these prescribed duties. It was implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, suggested that such endeavors distracted women from their spiritual obligations and natural place. Furthermore, the Church itself was one of the largest landowners in Europe, holding vast tracts of territory and operating under its own canon law. While some abbesses, particularly of wealthy convents, did manage significant estates, their power was always exercised within the confines of the church hierarchy, which was overwhelmingly male. These abbesses were often from noble families, and their authority over land was more an extension of their aristocratic connections and the collective power of their religious institution than an individual right to property. For the ordinary woman, the Church's teachings offered little support for independent land ownership. Instead, they promoted a societal structure where men were the heads of households, responsible for providing and protecting, and women were their helpmeets, bound by obedience. Confession, a central sacrament, provided an intimate channel for priests to reinforce these societal norms. A woman might be counseled against taking on responsibilities deemed outside her natural sphere, subtly guiding her towards acceptance of male authority in all matters, including property. Moreover, the Church championed the sanctity of marriage, viewing it as a divine institution. While this offered some protection for married women within their marital bonds, it also reinforced the concept of coverture, where a wife's legal identity merged with her husband's. A married woman was considered one flesh with her husband, and any property she brought into the marriage or might later acquire was effectively subsumed under his control. The Church's theological justification for marriage as a union where the husband was the head, just as Christ was the head of the Church, provided a spiritual underpinning for women's lack of independent property rights. Consider the example of Lady Eleanor, a woman in the late 11th century, who might have briefly inherited a small fiefdom due to the sudden death of her husband and only male heir. She would immediately face immense pressure from local clergy. Parish priests, visiting bishops, and even wandering friars would gently, but persistently, remind her of her womanly duties. She would be advised to remarry quickly, to find a strong husband who could rightfully manage the land and fulfill the feudal obligations. Sermons might touch upon the chaos that could ensue when women stepped outside their designated roles, implying that her independent ownership was a disruption to divine order. Even if she possessed the wit and capability to manage the estate, the constant religious and social pressure would be immense. The Church, by shaping the prevailing moral and social climate, thus created an environment where female land ownership was not just legally difficult, but also morally questionable and socially discouraged. Omnipresent influence meant that even if a woman overcame legal hurdles, she still had to contend with the deeply ingrained belief systems that relegated her to a subordinate role, making the prospect of truly owning and controlling land a constant theological and social battleground. Number 6. Pennies and powerless purses. Imagine trying to buy a house, or even just a small plot of ground today, without any independent income, savings, or access to credit. Now transport that nightmare to the year 1122, and you begin to grasp the formidable economic barriers that stood between women and land ownership. In a society largely devoid of a formal banking system, as we understand it, and where wealth was overwhelmingly concentrated in land, women faced systemic disadvantages in accumulating the capital necessary to purchase or even maintain property. Their purses often were not just light, they were entirely controlled by others. For the vast majority of women, opportunities to earn independent wealth were incredibly scarce. Most peasant women worked alongside their families on the land, their labor contributing to the household's survival, but rarely resulting in wages or personal savings that could be used for investment. Urban women might engage in crafts, trade, or service, but even in these spheres, their earnings were typically lower than men's and often considered supplemental to a male provider's income. A woman might spin wool, brew ale, or sell produce in the market, but the profits would often be subsumed into the family's shared resources, controlled by the male head of the household. The very concept of a woman building her own substantial capital through these means was practically unheard of. Furthermore, any significant wealth or inheritance a woman received, such as through a dowry or a gift, was almost immediately transferred to the control of her husband upon marriage. As we shall explore further, under the legal concept of coverture, a married woman effectively lost her independent legal and economic identity. Property became her husband's to manage, to sell, or to dispose of as he saw fit. She could not contract debts, enter into agreements, or conduct significant financial transactions without his consent, if at all. This meant that even if a woman came from a wealthy family, the moment she married, her access to that wealth for her own independent ventures, like purchasing land, evaporated. Consider the hypothetical plight of Matilda, a talented embroiderer from a relatively well-off merchant family in a town. Matilda diligently saved every shilling she earned from her intricate work, dreaming of one day buying a small cottage and garden plot outside the town walls, where she could live independently. However, the moment she married Thomas, a carpenter, her accumulated savings immediately became his. Thomas, a pragmatic man, might use her money to expand his workshop, to buy new tools, or perhaps to simply cover household expenses. Matilda's dream of purchasing land with her own hard-earned money was crushed, not by malevolence, but by the prevailing legal and economic structures. She no longer had access to her own funds, nor the legal standing to make such a purchase on her own behalf. Even for single women, such as spinsters or unmarried daughters of wealthy families, the avenues for acquiring capital were limited. While they might retain some control over inherited funds, these funds were often invested in ways that benefited the family unit or male relatives, rather than empowering the woman to make independent land purchases. Any land she might inherit might be managed by a male guardian or relative until she married, at which point it would fall under her husband's control. The economic landscape of 1122 was fundamentally agrarian, and power was synonymous with land. To acquire land, one needed capital, and to acquire capital, one needed access to independent economic activity and legal control over one's earnings. Women were systematically denied both. They were trapped in a cycle where their labor was undervalued, their earnings controlled by men, and their access to independent financial resources was virtually non-existent, making the dream of owning land an insurmountable economic challenge. Number 5. The untouchable scrolls. Imagine living in a world where the laws governing your very existence are written in a language you do not understand, transcribed on scrolls you are forbidden to touch, and interpreted by powerful figures who largely dismiss your voice. This was the reality for most women in 1122 when it came to legal knowledge and education, a formidable barrier that effectively shut them out of land ownership. In an era where literacy was a luxury even for many men, and legal systems were complex, archaic, and often unwritten, a woman's lack of access to education and legal knowledge was crippling. For the vast majority of the population, whether peasant or commoner, formal education was simply not available. Boys might learn a trade, and some aristocratic sons might be educated in Latin or Norman French, the languages of legal and ecclesiastical texts. Girls, however, were primarily educated in domestic skills, household management, and perhaps basic religious instruction. The idea of teaching a girl to read or write, let alone understand the intricate details of feudal law, inheritance customs, or property deeds, was considered unnecessary, even inappropriate. Their realm was the home, not the manor court or the king's chancery. Even if a woman were to gain some literacy, the legal documents of the time were not in plain English. They were typically in Latin or Norman French, filled with specialized terminology and convoluted phrasing. Imagine trying to decipher a complex modern legal contract written in a foreign language without any background in law. That is a glimpse into the difficulty faced by women in 1122. Without the ability to read these documents, let alone comprehend their implications, women were entirely dependent on male relatives, scribes, or local lords to interpret their rights, or lack thereof. This dependence placed them in an incredibly vulnerable position, susceptible to manipulation or misrepresentation. Consider the predicament of Alara, a daughter of a relatively prosperous farmer in the English countryside. Her father passed away suddenly, leaving a small but valuable tract of land. There was no clear written will, and the local customs regarding inheritance were complex and often contradictory. Alara's unscrupulous uncle, a man of some local standing, quickly asserted his claim to the land, citing obscure feudal customs and an alleged oral agreement with her deceased father. Alara, having received no formal education, could not read the few existing charters or legal precedents that might pertain to her case. She could not even understand the jargon used in the informal local court proceedings. She was forced to rely on hearsay, on the goodwill of neighbors, and on the interpretations provided by the men around her, who often had their own interests at heart. Uncle, on the other hand, had perhaps a basic literacy, or at least access to a local clerk or a cunning parish priest who could read and interpret relevant documents, however inaccurately. The legal system itself was fragmented. There was no unified national law, but rather a patchwork of local customs, manorial regulations, church law, and royal decrees, often passed down orally or kept in the private records of individual lords. Navigating this labyrinthine system required not just literacy, but also influence, connections, and a deep understanding of local traditions. Women, largely confined to their homes and excluded from public life, rarely possessed the networks or the practical experience to navigate these complexities. They could not represent themselves effectively in court, lacking the legal standing or the rhetorical skills necessary for such a public appearance. They were often required to have a male champion or guardian to speak on their behalf, further stripping them of agency. This profound lack of access to education and legal knowledge meant that even if a woman theoretically possessed a right to land, she was often powerless to assert it, understand it, or defend it, leaving her claim vulnerable to the machinations of those who understood the untouchable scrolls. Number 4, the whispers of society. Beyond the stark legal codes and economic realities, a powerful, pervasive force worked against women owning land in 1122, the relentless, often subtle whispers of society. Imagine growing up in a world where every story, every proverb, every neighborly gossip, and every public expectation told you exactly what a woman was and was not meant to be. These deeply ingrained social norms and expectations painted a picture of a woman's place that left little room for independent land ownership, shaping perceptions, influencing decisions, and discouraging any who dared to step outside the prescribed lines. In the High Middle Ages, societal roles were sharply delineated. Men were viewed as the providers, the protectors, the warriors, and the masters of the external world, the fields, the markets, the courts, and the battlefields. Their strength, their perceived rationality, and their ability to wield authority were seen as essential for managing property and maintaining order. Women, conversely, were primarily confined to the domestic sphere. Perceived virtues were obedience, chastity, piety, and the ability to bear and raise children. Their work, though vital, was largely unseen and unacknowledged outside the household. Cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, spinning, weaving, and tending small garden plots for immediate family consumption. The very idea of a woman engaging in the arduous, public, and often confrontational tasks associated with land management, overseeing tenants, collecting rents, resolving disputes, negotiating sales, or even participating in the physical labor of the fields, was often met with skepticism, ridicule, or outright disapproval. Consider the story of Beatrice, a young woman whose father, a respected miller, had no sons. In a very unusual turn, he might have considered leaving his mill, a valuable piece of property, to Beatrice, but the whispers would have begun immediately. How will a woman manage the mill? People would ask. She cannot lift the sacks, she cannot fix the gears, she cannot deal with the arguments over grain. Even if Beatrice possessed remarkable intelligence and a keen understanding of her father's trade, societal expectations would relentlessly undermine her legitimacy. Neighbors might refuse to bring their grain to her, preferring to deal with a man, even if he were less competent. The local lord, influenced by these same social norms, might pressure her to sell the mill to a male relative or a man of his choosing, or to marry someone he deemed suitable to take over its management. The social pressure to conform was immense. A woman who attempted to own or independently manage land might be seen as unnatural, unwomanly, or even dangerous. She might be accused of being too ambitious, too aggressive, or lacking in feminine grace. Such accusations, though not legal barriers, could have devastating social consequences. She could be ostracized by her community, lose the respect of her peers, and even struggle to find a suitable husband if she were unmarried, as men might be wary of a woman who challenged traditional roles. For married women, the idea of owning land independent of her husband was almost an affront to the concept of marital unity. A husband would be seen as failing in his duty if his wife independently managed property, and the wife herself might be seen as stepping outside the bounds of wifely obedience. These social norms were reinforced through every layer of society, from the folk tales told around the hearth, to the religious sermons in the church, to the casual conversations in the village square. They seeped into the consciousness of both men and women, shaping their aspirations and limiting their perceptions of what was possible. For a woman in 1122, even if the law bent a little, and even if she managed to acquire some economic means, the crushing weight of societal expectation, the subtle and not so subtle whispers of disapproval, formed an invisible, yet incredibly strong, barrier that made true, independent land ownership a path fraught with social peril and often public humiliation. Number 3, your dowry, his domain. Imagine a system where the very assets you bring into a relationship, meant to secure your future, instantly become someone else's to control, manage, and even dispose of. This was the complex and often frustrating reality for women in 1122 regarding the dowry and dower systems, structures that, while involving land or property, almost never granted women true, independent ownership. While these systems aimed to provide some economic security, especially in marriage or widowhood, they simultaneously reinforced male control over land and limited women's autonomy. Let's first unravel the dowry. Dowry was property or wealth that a bride brought with her to her husband upon marriage. This could include money, goods, livestock, or, significantly, land. The purpose of the dowry was multifaceted. It served as the wife's contribution to the new household, secured her future in case of her husband's death, though not as direct ownership, and often enhanced her status and marriage prospects. However, the crucial point is that upon marriage, the dowry immediately fell under the legal control of the husband. It ceased to be the wife's personal property in any meaningful sense and became part of the husband's estate to manage, and often to use as he saw fit. Consider the situation of Isabella, a wealthy heiress from a noble family, in a strategic marriage designed to forge alliances. Her dowry was immense, including several valuable manors. As soon as the marriage vows were exchanged, these lands, which had been in her family for generations, were no longer hers to command. Her new husband, a powerful baron, now controlled them. Collect the rents, appoint the stewards, decide on agricultural practices, and even, in many cases, sell or mortgage the land without Isabella's consent. While the land might still be referred to as her dowry, her practical power over it was non-existent. She might retain a theoretical interest in it, especially if the marriage ended in divorce, a rare occurrence, or if her husband died without male heirs, but for all intents and purposes during the marriage, it was his domain. Her role was primarily that of a conduit, a vessel through which valuable land passed from one male lineage to another. Then there was the dower, a system designed to provide for a widow. Dower was a specified portion of the husband's land or property that was set aside for his wife's maintenance after his death. This was typically 1/3 of his lands, to be held by her for the remainder of her life, or until her remarriage. While this provided a widow with a means of support and a place to live, it was not true ownership. dower land reverted to the husband's heirs upon her death, or sooner if she remarried. She could not sell it, bequeath it, or fundamentally alter it. Her rights were those of a tenant, a temporary holder, not a true proprietor. Imagine Lady Agnes, whose husband died unexpectedly, leaving her with several young children. Her dower rights granted her control over 1/3 of her husband's extensive estate. While this provided her with an income and a stately home, she was constantly under the watchful eye of her deceased husband's male relatives, his brothers or cousins who were the ultimate heirs. They might scrutinize her management, accuse her of wasting the estate, or pressure her to remarry so they could regain full control of the land. Agnes could not, for example, decide to sell a piece of her dower land to raise capital for her children, nor could she divide it amongst them in her own will. Her stewardship was temporary, constrained by the interests of the male lineage that ultimately claimed the land. Both the dowry and dower systems, despite their appearance of providing for women, were fundamentally mechanisms for transferring or temporarily holding land through women, rather than granting them genuine, independent control and ownership. They were intricately woven into the patriarchal structure of feudal society, ensuring that ultimate power over the most valuable asset, land, remained firmly in male hands. Number 2, becoming one flesh with your husband. Prepare yourself for a concept that might sound utterly alien in our modern world, a legal idea so pervasive in 1122 that it fundamentally erased a woman's individual existence in the eyes of the law, especially concerning property. This concept, known as coverture, declared that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity merged with that of her husband. She ceased to be an independent legal person. Instead, she became one flesh with him, and her legal status was subsumed into his. For women, this meant that the dream of owning land independently, even if inherited, evaporated the moment they said, "I do." Think of it like this: before marriage, an unmarried woman, a femme soul, possessed a limited but real legal standing. She could, in theory, own property, enter into contracts, and sue or be sued, although even then, her capacity was often restricted by social norms and practicalities. Instant she became a married woman, a femme covert, her legal personality became dormant, absorbed by her husband's. He became her legal representative in almost all matters. What did this mean for land ownership? Everything. Any land, property, or wealth a woman brought into the marriage, whether through inheritance, gift, or prior acquisition, immediately fell under the complete control and management of her husband. He had the right to collect rents, to use the land to sell it, or to mortgage it, often without her consent or even her knowledge. While some legal nuances might dictate that he couldn't completely disinherit her from her own ancestral lands without her tacit agreement, often obtained through a coerced public declaration, for all practical purposes, his authority was absolute. Consider the dramatic situation of Lady Aveline, a woman who, through a rare circumstance, inherited a substantial estate from her father, who died without any male heirs or other close male relatives. Aveline, as a femme soul, might briefly enjoy the power and independence that came with such a holding. She would manage the land, collect rents, and preside over her tenants, but the moment she married Lord Richard, all of that changed. The estate, her ancestral home, became Lord Richard's to control. He would now sit in the manor court, make decisions about the crops, and dictate the lives of the tenants. Aveline, once the mistress of her own domain, would now find herself relegated to the role of a wife, albeit a high-ranking one, with no independent legal authority over her own property. She could advise, she could persuade, but she could not command. Coverture meant a married woman could not buy or sell land on her own. She could not enter into contracts concerning land. She could not sue or be sued in her own name regarding property disputes. Her husband would have to act on her behalf. This system was not designed to be malicious, but it was deeply rooted in the social and legal beliefs of the time about the nature of marriage and the role of women. The husband was seen as the head of the household, responsible for protecting his wife and children and managing the family's assets. Her legal identity was, in essence, subsumed for her protection and for the perceived stability of the family unit, which was always represented by the male line. The idea that a wife would hold independent property rights was fundamentally incompatible with the concept of one flesh and the patriarchal order it upheld. Thus, for a woman in 1122, the path to marriage, while often necessary for survival and status, was simultaneously the pathway to the absolute dissolution of any hope for independent land ownership. Number 1. The iron grip of male inheritance. If you thought the previous barriers were challenging, prepare for the most fundamental and inescapable obstacle facing women who dreamed of owning land in 1122. The iron grip of male inheritance, specifically through the system of primogeniture and the very structure of feudalism. This was not a legal loophole or a societal whisper. It was the bedrock of medieval land tenure, a system designed to keep land and therefore power firmly in male hands from generation to generation. At the heart of this barrier lay primogeniture, the custom by which the eldest legitimate son inherited all of his father's land, titles, and property. This was the dominant inheritance practice among the nobility and gentry, and increasingly among prosperous freeholders, particularly in England after the Norman conquest. Why primogeniture? Because land in 1122 was not just an asset, it was the foundation of power, military service, and social order. Feudal society was built on a hierarchical system of landholding, where lords granted land to vassals in exchange for loyalty and, crucially, military service. A lord needed to know that a single, capable male heir would inherit the entire fief, ensuring continuity of service, stability, and preventing the fragmentation of valuable estates. Dividing land among multiple heirs, particularly female heirs, was seen as weakening the family's power and the feudal structure itself. Imagine the dramatic scene. A powerful baron or a prosperous knight dies suddenly. His grieving widow, his loyal daughters, and perhaps a younger son gather. Focus immediately shifts to the eldest son, even if he is just a boy. The entire estate, the castle, the villages, the vast forests, the fertile fields, all of it automatically passes to him. His sisters, regardless of their intelligence, capability, or even if they were older, inherited nothing in terms of direct land ownership. Their future lay not in commanding the lands, but in their dowries, which would be provided from the estate, now controlled by their brother, and in the marriage alliances that their new male head of household would arrange for them. This wasn't just about preserving family power, it was about preserving the feudal system. The land came with obligations, military service to the king or a higher lord, taxes, and the administration of justice among the tenants. These were seen as inherently male duties, requiring physical strength, political acumen, and public authority. A woman, by societal definition, was considered less capable of fulfilling these demanding roles. Thus, the very purpose of landholding was tied to male capacity and lineage. Even in cases where a man died without a son, the land rarely went directly to his daughters as owners. Instead, the land might become a wardship, managed by the king or a superior lord until a male heir was found, often a distant cousin, or until the daughter was married off to a man chosen by the overlord, who would then assume control of the lands through her. Her inheritance became a means to transfer the land to another male line, often with a hefty fee paid to the lord who arranged the marriage. This was especially true for significant landholdings. For smaller holdings, a daughter might inherit if there were absolutely no male heirs, but even then, her position would be precarious, and she would be expected to marry quickly, passing control to her husband. Consider the heart-wrenching fate of Lady Isolde, the only child of a minor baron. Her father, a proud man, had hoped desperately for a son, but none came. Upon his death, Isolde, despite being his sole descendant, could not simply inherit his barony. The land, by ancient custom and feudal dictate, would revert to her father's distant cousin, a man she barely knew. Isolde's future, once tied to the land she had known since birth, was now determined by a marriage arranged by the king, or by the cousin, to someone who would assume the barony. She would be granted a dowry, yes, but the land itself, the source of power and identity, would pass out of her immediate lineage, because the system demanded a male hand to hold the reins. Iron grip of male inheritance, enshrined in primogeniture and reinforced by the entire feudal structure, was the most profound and unyielding barrier, ensuring that the vast majority of land in 1122 remained firmly and exclusively in the hands of men.